Hello, I'm Paul Gates. Welcome to this week's episode of The Academics. Joining me today are our regular panelists, Professor Heather Page Preston and Dr. Dave Spiceland. In the spirit of Halloween, we're going to be getting to something kind of spooky, I guess, but we're also going to talk in a broader sense about the age-old tradition of storytelling. Why does it matter? What does it look like in today's age and in a digital age? And what stories we might talk about in the high country in the storytelling tradition. To start off, from the early use of storytelling to today, what makes storytelling so important?
Oh, everybody loves a story, and everybody loves a storyteller. There was this guy that, Bill Cox, wherever you are, I would love to get in contact with you. It's been almost 50 years now, but at lunch we would sit around and he would tell these jokes, which are stories, and we would laugh, and sometimes, in fact, I can't repeat most of these stories, but we loved Bill, we loved his stories, and the storytellers are very popular.
They are, yeah.
Well, there's storytelling and there's storytelling. We were talking about this earlier, how there's journalistic storytelling, and then there's the kind of storytelling that the high country is actually famous for.
Yeah.
So I thought we would talk about both of those.
More the oral tradition.
Yes,
yeah,
the
yeah.
oral.
Well, you know, storytelling predates, that tradition predates writing. So it probably ought to start with that one if we're talking about storytelling. It's so important because it connects us. It connects us as human beings. It connects us with our humanity. It truly is a universal feature of every culture, every country. It transcends language barriers in a way. Both the oral tradition and the mediated, because oral wasn't just sitting and telling a story, it was often acting out stories and accompanying it with facial, grimaces and laughter, and it was a little play in a way.
It'd be like a performance
Yeah,
for
it
a small group.
It was,
Sure.
yeah.
You remember the end of Star Wars? I'm trying to think which one it was.
Yes, which one?
Yeah, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I guess it would have been 6, which now we have 7, 8, and 9.
Uh-huh.
But they're doing the whole thing with the little short guys or whatever, and so C-3PO is translating. And you don't need a translator to see there's a story going on. There's things that are happening.
Yes, whether it's beats and words or
Yeah.
Well, we ought to talk about storytelling in the high country, actually, because this area is very well known. Back into colonial times, apparently, very well known for storytelling. There's the Ray Hicks, which I think some of our viewers who maybe have been around the high country a little longer might remember him. And he won competitions up and down the Appalachians. He was well known.
Very famous storyteller, particularly of the Jack tales.
Right.
Yeah. So the lad named Jack and all the mischief he got up to.
And of course, his son continued that after Ray died. I think Ray died sometime in the late 90s, I want to say. But his son, Ray Jr., ran the Green Box recycling area over in Ajo.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and apparently, and I never did this myself, but apparently if you went over there to dump your trash and your recycling, if you asked him, he would tell you a story.
Probably how Ajo got its name, which is one of the popular stories up here. Yeah.
I don't know that one. But,
well, there were a group of men sitting around the stove, supposedly, trying to figure out what to name the area, and they got tired of swapping lies and telling all these stories, and one just leaned back and said, Ajo, and they named it that.
That's kind of like Hell, Michigan, it's the same thing, not the same thing, but somebody said, what should we name this community? He said, oh, call it Hell if you want. So that name stuck.
There you go.
And I've been there to Hell, Michigan.
So it does exist?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a real place.
So if someone tells you to go, you can say, I've already been there.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there are still competitions. I haven't heard about these so much recently, but competitions that are held annually in the not just the high country, but up and down the Appalachian chain.
Jonesboro is known for its annual storytelling festival. People come from all over the world to go to Jonesboro, Tennessee, which isn't that far from us, actually. Yeah, about 3 hours.
Have you ever been to that?
No, but I would love to go. I've heard it's absolutely fascinating.
But that's an adventure.
Yeah.
So anybody know anything more about storytelling?
Well,
in the high
in
country
terms of
before we-
academia,
Okay.
I teach a couple of writing classes, and there was this one class, around midterm, sometimes I'll have note cards, and I'll say, ask me any question you want. Keep it anonymous, and one time somebody asked where I bought my shirts, and really deep, I guess. But somebody said, could we do a component on storytelling? And I hadn't thought about that, so I worked up this thing that I usually talk about in my broadcast news writing class. What makes for a good story? And I mentioned popular literature, popular music, that it's a story. It might be 2 or 3 minutes. MacArthur's Park at 7 minutes and 20 seconds. One of your favorite songs, I understand. But there's a story. You don't know exactly what his story is in MacArthur's Park, but
I don't know about that cake in the rain.
yeah. But everybody loves a story. And I mean, when we were kids and somebody pulled out a book and, Once Upon a Time, and we sat there enthralled. And I went to my son's class in his first grade class, and they would have the parents come and read stories, so that was cool.
So why do we like stories so much?
Oh, wow, they're creative. They intrigue us. They spark our imagination. They arouse our emotions. They tap into everything that makes us human. They play with our minds. We have to work out the puzzle along with the storyteller.
Do they have to be true?
No, they're usually not.
Usually not, right?
I mean, look at a lot of dates and how those go in terms of stories they tell about themselves. We're probably going off the where we shouldn't here, but and a lot of times people know they're lies or they're not true.
Mm-hmm.
I was watching something last night at home, and it was a sort of a spooky story. And I was by myself, and I thought, okay, I don't believe in ghosts, but you listen for the little knocks and
Oh, you heard the floor
noise.
creaking. And
Yeah, everybody loves to be scared a little bit. There's something about, like, the National Enquirer, which, by the way, a lot of times what's on the front turns out to be true many times.
Actually, there is real journalism in there, yes.
There is.
Yeah.
It's like the sad last days of, like, I saw Jackie Gleason. I thought, didn't even know he was ill. And then shortly thereafter, he died. But the Enquirer is a little bit different than some of these other publications that they're not telling the truth.
Yeah. Well, as long as let's not talk about the Enquirer too much, but back to your storytelling in your class, Dave, that the student raised. Now we're talking about journalism and communication and so forth, and the role that storytelling plays there. And storytelling's always been part of journalism as well.
Oh, absolutely.
I want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I was going to say Nellie Bly
Mm-hmm.
in the Yellow Press period, going into an insane asylum and
Around the world.
yes, around the world, and telling stories about her adventures and actually bringing about positive social change. And that's, storytelling is very, very powerful. It's not just for fun, grins and giggles. It requires a lot of us, not only the listeners, to listen attentively and get something from it, but also the storyteller himself, because you have to consider what's most important. You have to understand who your readers or listeners are. You have to construct the story in a fashion that they can follow, so there has to be linear construction for it. And if we're talking print anywhere, or we're talking an oral tradition, and it can be very cathartic for both the teller and the listener. You must self-reflect in order to construct a well-written story and a well-told story.
And you mentioned linear, in Eastern literature, there's something very different about, you don't go from A to B to C to D. Many times you go from D to B to C, and it drives Western minds crazy because that's the way that they not just tell a story, but that's a teaching method. If you look at some of the Old Testament literature, something in the Tanakh, it tends to be, like the book of Jeremiah, is not chronological. It goes from here to here to here to here, and it drives, again, Western minds just crazy.
Well, Dunkirk did that this summer. Yes, that was one of the criticisms, that it jumped back and forth
I
in
would
the,
love to see
in the
more
timeline.
maps. Yeah, more geographical explanations there.
Okay.
We talk here about the oral tradition as almost like a play, and to kind of look at that journalistically. How about radio? And the
War of the Worlds, since
War
it's
of the
close to
Worlds.
Halloween.
Yeah.
Halloween, of course. We're going to get around to Halloween for sure.
Yes, we are.
And but the way what you have to use as as a device to get your story across on radio, of course, is different than it would be in print or even in photography.
Yeah, on
certainly
television.
On television.
Yeah.
But you know, you have to paint a word picture. I mean, you've got to, you know, and employ sound effects and all those cool things to get people, because you're
Voice inflection.
You're
Yes,
making
yeah.
them create the picture in their own minds. You're helping them do that, but they have to. That's what makes it work, is when they can put all that together and scare themselves in the sense of War of the Worlds.
And you have to have redundancy. You know, I tell students, whether it's writing for commercial copy or for the news, they may tune in halfway through your story or through what you're doing or a commercial. So particularly at the beginning, you know, leads are important for news to at least sum up very quickly what's going on there. And a lot of times people will tune in late, like the War of the Worlds. There were a lot of people that didn't hear the disclaimer.
Yes, at the beginning.
This is a recreation. And Orson Welles, I have taught a special topics class on Orson Welles. And Orson is was an interesting guy. In fact, he's a legend in his own mind. But he was a genius. And the problem was he knew he was a genius. And you know, the next day in New York, and by the way, this summer, I went to 485 Madison Avenue, which is where the War of the Worlds came from, and had a picture, a little selfie. I don't do too many selfies, but I had a selfie of me there in front of the building. But Orson, he knew what he was doing. The next day at the newsreel, he said, "I'm so sorry, and I did not know," and I'm paraphrasing. He knew exactly what he was doing, which led to his contract with RKO, and he did Citizen Kane. RKO wanted him to do another War of the Worlds, and he said, "No, I've already done that." And I think part of the point here is the good storytelling, and Orson Welles was a good storyteller, and in spite of all of his faults.
Well, you know, we're going back 79 years now with War of the Worlds. I had a minute there to do the arithmetic.
Yeah, I was wondering how quick you did that.
I was working on that while you were talking, Dave.
You weren't listening to me.
How does storytelling change in the last 79 years? Is it still a viable method of communicating among people?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. In fact, storytelling had to take a back seat through most of the 20th century to numbers, to statistics. And what happened was, particularly in the business world, was you started referring to people as human resources, right? And you took the will to live out of folks. They took the stories to the water coolers, as opposed to having productive conversations in businesses. And in business in particular, in order to get people to be creative and innovate, you had to bring storytelling back. They realized the error of their ways. Numbers can only get you so far. If you neglect the people and the stories they have to tell, their voices, their personal truths, you're going to damage your organization.
Is that because numbers are almost by definition dry?
Yeah, well, that's
impersonal.
That's part of it, but they only tell part of the story. Numbers can show you patterns, but they can't tell you how those patterns apply to each and every individual. Only people can do that. And the difference between numbers and storytelling is, while we all may be able to recognize a pattern, we're not necessarily able to find our place in that pattern. And with storytelling, what you find is that even though the story may have nothing to do with us, there is some essential quality in it that we can relate to. So while there may not be a true meta-narrative for everyone, there are some universal truths that apply.
As a historian, I have a guilty pleasure. If I had something that I could magically dream up, I guess this is my story, a time machine, it would be so cool to go back and find out what in the world is that Stonehenge thing anyway? Because there has to be a story there. There has to be, again, as a historical look at it, what were they doing?
And what's great about that is that story keeps changing as they discover more and more. They piece it together in a different way. It's a different interpretation. And all of a sudden, things make a little bit more sense than they did before. That's part of the neat mystery, yeah.
Well, they were telling themselves stories by constructing Stonehenge and the pyramids and their Easter Island and all kinds of examples of that. Yeah. Well, now we've gone back really far. But in the digital age, has that changed the nature of storytelling, or the techniques, or what's?
I'm going to say no.
Yeah, okay.
There's a little different spin on it, and we may disagree about some of this, but when somebody pulls out their phone and they pull up the Federalist Papers or Democracy, I'm trying to think what the other side of the coin is here, but they're looking for, whether it's truthful or not, some sort of story about an explanation, whether it's political or whatever. I think there's some relevance there.
Actually, I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm just going to maybe have a slightly different interpretation. Digital storytelling is really, really interesting because it's made it possible to keep the oral tradition alive for certain communities, particularly Native American communities. I have a couple of friends who were in my Ph.D. cohort, and they run a digital storytelling traveling organization to go to Native communities and keep that alive. It allows people to get out from their perspective within the community the stories that are important to them on their timeline. And that's really important because most of what most of America knows about Native American communities has not been told by the Native Americans themselves. Mm-hmm. It's been told by mainly white male culture. So you're going to get a different story necessarily from the people who live the reality every day. And that's a really neat thing. It, as I mentioned before, it allows them to reflect and heal. It allows them to push for change because people can now connect those statistics with alcoholism and access or no access to certain educational systems or funds with the people it's affecting on a daily basis. And that's really neat. Digital storytelling has allowed us to go back to folk art and produce our own little videos. You got a pretty powerful thing in your phone, right? It's a movie making machine, it's a music making machine, it's all sorts of things.
I would agree with both of you that really that it hasn't changed, but it has opened up new frontiers, I would say, in storytelling. Your Native American example.
Yeah.
And Dave, the platform is different. I think that's really the only way it's changed.
Yeah. It's kind of like
adopted.
Broadcasting, narrowcasting. When we had cable come along and satellite television, those kind of things, that we could narrow the audience, we could narrow the focus, we could narrow the advertising dollars, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And we haven't talked about advertising, but that's an important part of the telling the story, and we'll be right back after this kind of thing.
Well, we haven't talked about print, storytelling in print yet. Is that effective? I mean, can you think of some good examples? I always think of the Wall Street Journal when they used to have the 5-column layout, and what I always called the middle column would be a focused feature story that would use the circumstances, the experiences of, say, a family or an individual to tell a broader story, maybe a nationwide story. I think today, if we think about the opioid crisis, you could talk about the experiences of one family, in the Midwest, and use that to illustrate the broader problem nationwide. So I think that's particularly effective.
If I had one gripe or one thing that I would like to see changed, and I'll pick on young people here, there's a device that's just been discovered that doesn't need electricity. You don't have to plug it in. You take it and you have pages that you turn the pages and you read pages. I wish our students, I wish our whole society, but particularly students, would read books. The classics, if I can ever write a book, maybe my book, but just something to where it's a different experience than pulling your smartphone out and looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely there's a need, and it's not just young people. In fact, I always take a quick poll in class when I do the mass media class, and what I find is that more and more students are reading for pleasure, and they're reading paper. Mm-hmm. They don't want to read it digitally. They want the experience, the tactile experience, which is a large part of the enjoyment of reading. Yeah.
Well, thinking of Halloween.
Are we going to
telling stories? What do you know for spooky stories at Appalachian?
Oh, at Appalachian. Well, I know about East Hall.
Yeah.
Yes, apparently there's a female ghost or a male ghost in the female bathroom on the 3rd floor of East Hall. That's one that I know about. I know kind of more the high country in terms of spooky stories. And speaking of stories, I wore a little black cat. This is the first piece of jewelry my dad ever gave my mother. And she gave it to me not too long ago, so I thought I would.
There's a story there.
Yes, I know that it connects us with
Halloween
our
story.
history and a Halloween story.
And superstitions, black
absolutely.
cats, and numbers.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, you know, depending on who you talk to around here, there's every building on campus, you know, is probably haunted in some way.
Oh, I don't know about that. Some of them seem like they ought to be if they're not. But
the one
yeah.
I've heard is, you know, the first building at Appalachian was where I.G. Greer is now. It's, you know, it's
Yeah.
a different building
Yeah,
now,
yeah.
but that's the site. Well, since it would be the oldest if we still had it, that's supposedly haunted.
Well, I.G.
And
Greer is a little
the
creepy,
haunt
you have
has-
to admit.
The haunt has transferred itself apparently to I.G. Greer.
Well, yeah.
I've heard.
Yeah, well, they stay around. The buildings change.
Have we got some time here?
Just a little bit.
Quick question. Have you two ever seen a ghost?
No,
Seen one? No.
but I've heard them.
Experienced one? You've heard them?
Heard 'em.
Smelled phantom smells that were not there, enough to make me get up and go put my hands on the stovetop because it
Okay.
smelled like someone frying bacon.
Poltergeists?
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, I think so.
yeah.
I think
Okay.
so. Yeah.
Some weird experiences.
And I'm convinced, as far as seeing them, nah. But
A presence?
being aware of their presence, I would say yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, to close the show, Dr. Spiceland is going to give us a fun fact about the history of the high country. And I think it might have something to do with Halloween.
Could be. Yeah, we'll make sure it's relevant.
Go ahead.
So, did you know that the Green Park Inn in Blowing Rock has been listed as a haunted historical site? Built in the 1800s, it's said that the 3rd floor is haunted by a woman who passed away there in recent years and can be seen walking through the hallways of the 3rd floor. And by the way, that green horse in the front has been reported. People have called to say, please help that poor green horse. I kid you not. I don't make this up. I have talked to people who have stayed there, and apparently, and it has had some renovations, but it's an old building, ideal for. We don't want to have a defamation suit here, so we'll keep it. Whatever. I mean, it's a good place to go visit if you're in Blowing Rock. I think that who's the woman that wrote Gone with the Wind? Margaret Mitchell.
Margaret Mitchell.
She used to summer in Blowing Rock, and a lot of famous people did. Yeah,
Wow.
that's a true story.
Okay, there's our fun fact.
And it was excellent writing, by the way, whoever wrote this.
It was factual. Well, that's our time for today. I'm Paul Gates. We hope you'll join us next time on The Academics.